Well, we're going to continue our overview of the book that I wrote in 2009 called Suffering Loss. It's just really a jet plane ride over the terrain. Boy, history was actually made this week. As I said the other day, this is a book that my students, for whatever reason, have basically boycotted en masse since 2009. This week I didn't know what was going on. Actually, one student came and bought it. And then when a second student came and bought it yesterday, I thought that surely the Lord was going to come, by before this morning. But anyway, for the two of you, thanks for for being willing to look at it and process it. But we're talking under the main umbrella heading of experiencing healing and fruitfulness in the valley of pain and loss. We lost our girls in 1996. It wasn't until about 2006 that I even began to seriously put pen to paper to begin the process of writing the book. And although many people had encouraged me along the way, saying that they thought that God was going to definitely be in the process of because they heard different things that would come out in my ministry, in the area of like 2002, 2003. I was beginning to process some of it as I was speaking, and different friends. My closest male friend, Chris Ball. Basically said, I know that you're going to write a book. You got to put some of these principles in writing. And initially I resisted, but eventually I came to the place where I said, if I'm going to do it, I've got to do it from a place of what I call, and I'll talk about this phrase in a minute, substantial healing. I didn't want to, I suppose I could have had some things that might have been powerful to say, in the late 90s, but it would have been basically processed through raw pain. And I didn't want to impart anything, into the life of God's people that didn't come, through the filter of having a substantial healing in my own life. And so really around 2006, I began to process it and to work through it. And I waited that long, because the title of the book itself, or the subtitle, is Discovering the Blessing of Change, Growth, Healing, and the Hope of a Beautiful Life, which I'm actually choosing to use the term for our class today, fruitfulness. That is, in the midst of the deepest losses that we can ever encounter in our life, not only is there healing available, the Lord walks with us through the valley of the shadow of death. But not only is there healing that's available, there's fruitfulness. And amazingly, as I'm going to comment towards the end, there are certain blessings, and I don't even understand how it's possible that this actually works out. But I know that it's a reality, that in the end you have new blessings that come into your life that are not only profound, but they're blessings that could not have come into your life unless you had actually experienced that loss. And so all of that is a part of God's economy, a part of His kingdom principles, and a part of the cross, which is what we're going to have some things to say about today. So we're going to add to part 1 5 more biblical truths that empower us to experience healing and fruitfulness in the valley of pain and loss. And number 1 for this morning is we must embrace the process of healing. If we're going to experience real healing and fruitfulness in the valley of our pain and our losses, we must embrace the process of healing. There weren't many things in the early weeks after the loss of our girls that basically were able to penetrate into my spirit. But one of the verses that God made very, very clear, there was a few things that people said that really were like rhema words, but I was basically reading the Beatitudes, and I came to that phrase where Jesus speaks it in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 4, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." And it was just like the Holy Spirit arrested my heart, when I read those words. And I felt what the Lord was saying to me is, my son, there's going to be a real comfort, and there's going to be real healing that's going to come through my comfort, but you can't have the comfort and you can't have the healing unless you go through the process of mourning. Many people move into a form of denial, after the loss, some significant loss in their life, whether we're talking about the loss of a loved one, whether we're talking about something that happens catastrophically in the area of our physical body, whether we're talking about the loss of a job, whether we're talking about divorce, whether, some other area of pain that's inserted that comes crashing into our life seemingly out of nowhere at the wrong time. When we begin to deal with those things, sometimes people move in an area of denial and say, well, it really doesn't make any difference. It's no big deal. I'll get over it. Don't worry about me. Different things like that people will say, and really they're attempting to deal with the loss by minimizing it, and basically saying there's a certain process that I probably need to walk through, and I'm not willing to walk through it. And so, denial can short circuit the comfort of the Lord in our life. The healing process must begin with honesty. And honesty for me was Proverbs 13:12. Hope deferred makes the heart sick, but when the desire comes, it is a tree of life. And the contrasting thoughts there. If you have a certain desire that God has birthed in your heart, and you begin to lay hold of that, you begin to see the reality of it, it becomes a tree of life for you. But when you have a certain hope that is deferred or smashed, your heart becomes sick. And I remember, thinking, one of the things that was a very vivid hope in my mind for what would have been my firstborn granddaughter, Jessica Grace. We had actually bought a special chair, that we had put in our daughter's home. It was a rocking chair, and she was saying, I'm going to be able to rock, my baby when I bring her home from the hospital, and it's this chair that I'm going to feed her in, and so we were really looking forward to that to that moment ourselves. And I pictured the last time I was at her home, I looked at that chair, and I didn't even go and sit in it. In my mind I said, I'm going to wait until after the baby's born, and when we come down after the baby's born, I'm going to sit in that chair for the first time. And I'm going to have my daughter come, and I'm going to have her lay, my little granddaughter, in my arms. And I'm going to dedicate her to the Lord and pray for her, to touch her and hold her for the very first time. That was a very, very vivid image in my mind, of what I was convinced was going to be a reality. And I had every expectation that it would be a reality. But in that moment, within an hour's time, in that cold, snowy March night in 1996, it was like all of those plans that I had, picturing what would be. I pictured my daughter and what an amazing mother she would be. I pictured holding my granddaughter. I pictured watching her grow up, move into her destiny. All those plans were like written out on a whiteboard. And it was like the huge hand of God took one of those erasers and just wiped the whole board clean. And I got to tell you, my heart was sick. Hope that not only was deferred, but really was deferred permanently. I never would be able to hold my daughter again in this life. I would never be able to hold that granddaughter in this life. And so hope deferred makes the heart sick. And so you have to begin with the honesty of the process. And the healing process must resolve the powerful emotions of shock, confusion, anxiety, and anger. People say, you know what, I would never get angry with God. If you make that statement in the midst of catastrophic loss, you're obviously a more godly person than Job was. And as far as God was concerned, he was the most godly man on the face of the whole earth at that time. But if you've ever read the book of Job, you see that Job got plenty angry at God. And, there were times when I got angry with the Lord. Matter of fact, there were times when I was so angry. I sat in my living room one day, and I just I was just feeling that that unbelievable loss, and trying to grapple with it and wrap my mind around it, and adding 2 plus 2 on my spiritual calculator, and I couldn't make it add up to 4. And I remember just like shaking my fist at the Lord, and said, you know what, I hate you for what you did. People say, "Oh, you committed the obviously you committed the unpardonable sin there." But that was really what was in my heart at that moment. I was so angry, that it was almost like I didn't want him in my life. But literally within 5 minutes, I was crying in his presence, and I said, "Jesus, forgive me. I don't hate you. I love you with all my heart. I'm just going out of my mind with this pain." And it was like, it wasn't like the Lord fell off his throne, when I shook my fist at that particular point. He knew that was in my heart. He knew the reality of what was there. And, he came around me, and he held me, and he certainly forgave me. So you have to deal with all those emotions. And one of the things for me, was the tremendous anxiety that I began to feel for those who were close to me. Because basically up until that time, I had come to the place where I basically said, okay, really my family, my children, my grandchildren, they're going to be invincible. Because there's a spiritual covering, and it's a spiritual covering that's there because I'm a patriarch in this family, and I have faith for my children, I have faith for my grandchildren, and there's going to be safety and there's going to be protection, and and basically now I'm coming to grips with the fact that what, anything is possible. And one of the things that I realized was shortly after, literally within 3 or 4 weeks, I guess it must have been. Maybe like about 3 weeks after we had lost, our girls and the funeral, and I'm back here. I'm back teaching. I'm, back in the saddle as much as I can be here at the school. And the junior senior banquet, which was the big social event of the year, we don't do it anymore, but it used to be like a big social event, and the girls would go and buy all brand new dresses, and so anyway, it was the junior senior banquet. And we were my daughter, my youngest daughter, was a senior here, and so she had she had bought a special dress, and she was going, and we had about 15, 18 women in our house all afternoon of the banquet, getting ready, and curling irons plugged into every single outlet in the house. I finally went over to the tab to find a bathroom where I could at least shave and get ready myself. The house was just crawling with all of her friends and students. But anyway, at that particular point, the students were taking off, and it was around 5 o'clock, and my wife and I were getting ready to leave probably around 5:15. The banquet was starting around 6. And so I heard the fire alarm go off in Lima. And I always hate it when that goes off. It means either there's a fire somewhere or there's a serious motor vehicle accident. And so I found myself just kind of praying for whatever it was. I didn't know what it was. And so we left the house, Connie and I, around quarter of, and we're headed down 15A there. And as we're coming over one of the knolls, actually before you get to Corby's collision there, I couldn't actually see it, but there was a horrendous motor vehicle accident that had taken place. And the state police were there, and they had actually closed the road. In fact, it did turn out to be a fatality, and they were trying to get one woman out of the car. But I couldn't see the cars at that point, and they were diverting all the traffic. And I'm thinking, we've literally had hundreds of our students that have been going down this road right now. The chances of it being one of our students is really, really great. And so I said, so I got out of my car instead of doing the detour there, and I went to the state policeman, and I said, I'm the dean of students at the school, and part of my responsibility is to have some pastoral care and oversight. And I said, we're having a very special function tonight. And I said, it's very, very possible that this accident has involved, a couple of our students. And I'm wondering if you'd allow me to go through so that I could be on the scene and minister if there's a need. And amazingly, the trooper said, "Yeah, okay, I'll let you do that." So he moved the barricade, and as I'm coming over, coming up that hill, where I actually saw the carnage, with several cars that were involved. My first thought was, it's very possible it could be one of my students. And then I'm thinking, my own daughter, was in one of these cars. And the first thought that popped into my mind was, God, there's no way that you would ever allow something to happen to my second daughter. You would never do that. And then almost immediately a thought came into my mind and said, yeah, sure you would. I guess that's really the kind of God that you are. And, just like that, it was there. And when I got there, of course, I felt great loss for the people that were injured and the woman that did die. She was actually from the community here, but none of our students were involved. But as I drove away, finally, from that accident to go to the banquet, I said to my wife, I hate that these kind of thoughts are there. But being honest about them is all part of the process. C.S. Lewis, in the book that he wrote called The Grief Observed after his wife died of cancer, he makes this statement. He says, "Not that I am, I think, in much danger of ceasing to believe in God. The real danger is of coming to believe such dreadful things about him. The conclusion I dread is not, so there's no God after all, but so that this is what God is really like. Deceive yourself no longer." Well, that's kind of where I was at different points, in my grief. I came to the place where, I knew God was there, and I knew the reality of His presence. But at moments, I began to struggle with, is this really the way that you're like with the children that you love, so deeply? And again, those are things that you work through, but you can never work through them, and you can never find healing unless you're completely open and honest about the feelings that are there. And so that's the first part of the process. I'd like to talk just a minute before we move on about this term, substantial healing. This was something that Sister Sylvia and I went round and round about, because she really strongly disagreed with me. She was, coming to alongside and asked if she could read portions of the manuscript, because she was very, very involved in the early days, with our family. Was just, she rearranged her whole schedule and showed up at the funeral down in Virginia Beach, sat with our family for a couple of days. It was really, her ministry was very, very profound to our family, and she was very profoundly involved with Renee's life, our daughter that we had lost. Prophesied over her many times, and so she was just really connected with us in the whole area of walking through, and would often come to the house and pray with us. And so when she heard I was writing the book, she said, "Would you mind if I if I looked at different portions of the manuscript?" I said, "Oh man, if you would read it all, it would be wonderful to me. I would cherish your insights." And so I actually had two editors that worked with me, great editors. One that I actually paid to be involved in the editing process, but Sister Sylvia, free of charge, just gave it some very, very careful editing. And one of the things I deal with in the book is that I am convinced that in areas of deep catastrophic loss, you never come to a place where you experience complete healing. You experience substantial healing, but there's areas, in the areas of our deepest losses that are never completely healed in this life. And it was a phrase that was actually spoken to my wife. We was hundreds of people, of course, at the funeral, almost 1,000 at the funeral, and then the open house that we had. Hundreds of people were coming through. Many of them I knew. Many of them were my daughter's friends that I didn't know. And anyway, one couple that had gotten close to Doug and Renee, came through the house the night after the funeral. And this woman came up, and they had lost a son many, many years earlier to cancer, but he had died at the same age as our daughter. And the woman came up to my wife. I was standing by her, and I heard her make the comment, and she took her hand, and just gently she tapped my wife, on her breastbone. And she said, "Honey," she said, "you're going to walk through some unbelievable pain, and you will experience some deep healing. But," she said, "you'll have to learn for the rest of your life to live with a sob that sits right here. To live with a sob that sits right here." Well, we didn't even really know what that meant at that point. But 2013, we both live with a sob that sits right here. I've experienced deep healing, substantial healing. But there's still that area, and I'm convinced that's what's happening in Revelation chapter 7 when we stand around the throne and it says, "He will dry and wipe away every tear from our eyes." Well, why are we crying in the eternal kingdom? I think at that point, all the things that still haven't moved into that area, what I would call complete healing, that sob, when I stand in His presence on that day, will burst forth one more time. And the Lamb of God, will wipe the tears away from my eyes. And for all eternity now, the healing will be complete and will be final and will be deep. Well, Sister Sylvie and I went around about that. She actually wanted me to change the book, and I said, "No, we've just got to choose to disagree, on this because, this is really what I feel." And but anyway, in the end, she came to me because she began to talk to different people in her life that had experienced, deep loss. And she came to me and she said, I really do believe, you're right. And so we left the book, the same. I was going to leave it the same anyway, because I had to be true to what I felt the Lord was saying to me. So substantial healing, deep healing, real healing, but there's still a sob. And just the other day, it was. It's like turning your back on the ocean when you're coming into the ocean if it's a real choppy day, and if you're not paying close attention, a wave can knock you down. And that's sometimes what happens. And it's years and years later, and I go through days and days and weeks sometimes, without even feeling any pain at all. But the other day I was just in the grocery store, and there was I was looking at the soups, and there was a package of ramen noodles, all the ramen noodles. Well, my daughter loved ramen noodles. She's always stocked them in her room. She always said it's the worst thing for you. They're salty, but they taste good, and you can do it late at night when you're studying. And so, she was a ramen noodles freak. And and I'm looking at ramen noodles, and and the sob burst forth. Made me think of my daughter and how much I missed her, still after all these years. And somebody walked by in the aisle. I'm standing there looking at ramen noodles, and I'm crying, and you're thinking, is he going to pull out a gun? What's he going to do? This guy's coming unglued. Let's get away from him. But it's a sob. But one day that sob will burst forth, and He will dry every tear from our eyes. So it's a process of healing. Number 2, we must embrace the experience of the cross. The cross, I have come to see, is the call to experience intimate fellowship with the sufferings of Christ. Philippians 3, verses 10 and 11, that I may know Him and the power of His resurrection and the fellowship of His sufferings. That word fellowship is koinonia. Paul said, I want to know Him. I want to know the power of His resurrection. But to know Him and know the power of His resurrection, to know the resurrection power on the other side, I have to experience the death process on this side. And that involves, fellowship, with His sufferings. As we look at this whole area, I used to think that the cross was just simply, basically, this is what God wants and this is what I want, and so the cross means I say no to what I want and yes to what He wants. Matter of fact, one of the teachers that I had when I first came here, right after I was saved, said that the cross simply is God's will crossing your will. And Jesus says, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. And so it's a matter of choosing the will of God instead of your own will. And it certainly is a part of the cross. But I've come to understand now, because suffering is a normal part of the Christian life, that suffering is something that brings us in to an encounter with the cross, an encounter with intimate, deep fellowship with the sufferings that our Lord himself experienced. We'll never understand those depths, but we can share in it in the area of fellowship. And the cross must be embraced personally. We talked about this earlier, many weeks ago. We dealt with this passage in John, where Jesus was saying, "Do you love me?" And we talked about the significance of the two Greek words that were used there. But in the end, when Jesus, finally gets the declaration from Peter the third time, "Yes, I love you, Lord." Peter's grieved. Why does he keep coming after me like this? And finally the Lord says, you were going to feed my sheep, and there's going to come a time, he said, when you will stretch out your hands, another will bind you or gird you, carry you where you do not wish to go, talking about the manner of death that Peter was going to die. So, Jesus is basically prophesying his martyrdom. And the first thing out of Peter's mouth, in this situation is not, I don't want to be martyred. No, Peter, I think, was more than willing to be martyred, even at that point. But the first thing out of his mouth is, well, if it's going to happen that way for me, what about for John? What about for John? I expect that he's going to have the same treatment. And Jesus says, if I want him to live until I come, what's that to you? You have to make the decision personally whether you're going to embrace the suffering that I have for you. It might be very different for John, and in fact it was. Not that John got off scot-free. I don't think being boiled in oil is, you consider the guy probably had this serious scarring, from burns all over his body, and the horror of that experience on the island, on the Isle of Patmos as a political prisoner. It's definitely not a piece of cake, but it was different. And Jesus is basically saying we have to embrace the suffering that's there. And so when you have something happen in your life, it's very, very easy to begin to look at somebody else, who isn't going through that kind of suffering, and basically begin to, in some ways, almost resent them. I had to deal in my own heart with some of my beloved colleagues. It was right, as a matter of fact, there was a number of us, Ben Dodswhite and Barry Qualick, and there were some others of friends in my immediate circle whose daughters were all pregnant at the same time my daughter was pregnant. Now, my daughter has died, and her baby died with her. And now, Brother Barry's daughter, she had her baby. And Brother Ben's daughter, she had her baby. And, another one of my friends, his daughter, had her baby. And we're all in this little circle. It wasn't Facebook in those days, but it was, flying emails back and forth. Every single day I would get on, and Brother Ben would have a picture of his grandson. So I just want to post a picture of the most beautiful grandson in the world. And Barry Qualick would get on and say, I respectfully acknowledge that your grandson is very beautiful, but obviously you haven't seen how gorgeous, my grandson is. And, then somebody else would jump in and say, my granddaughter is, more beautiful than all of them. And it was just this wonderful repartee that was, pictures, flying over cyberspace, flying over the internet, and I'm sitting there at my computer, and I'm thinking, I'm thankful that they're holding their grandchildren, but how come I don't get to do that? How come they get that experience and I don't? A little bit of the Peter syndrome. What about them? What about John? And Jesus says, you have to embrace what I have allowed to come into your life, and that is embracing the cross for you personally. Embracing the cross is motivated by friendship, as we saw, using that word phileo. I will follow Christ no matter where it leads. Number 3, we must give to others out of our pain. it's kind of a no-brainer, but we see this in the life of Joseph being a wonderful example. Joseph 39, or Genesis 39, Joseph, of course, is been sold as a slave, and it says the Lord was with him, so he succeeded in everything he did as he served in the home of his Egyptian master. We can never forget that the blessing that came into Joseph's life was directly related to making a choice to serve in the midst of his pain. And then, of course, he's slandered by Potiphar's wife. He's thrown into prison. Genesis 39, verse 21, the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love. And the Lord made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden. In other words, in the prison, he basically could have retreated into a corner. He could have become secluded. He could have become isolated. He could have become bitter. But in that situation, he says, I've been wrong. And really my condition now is worse than when I was even sold into slavery. In Potiphar's house, I had freedom. Now I have no freedom. But even in the midst of that suffering, he not only embraces it personally, but he says, how can I serve, in the midst of it? And so as we look at that, we continue on, and, finally he's even names his children, Manasseh and Ephraim. Manasseh means God has made me forget. Ephraim means fruitful, or actually twice fruitful, and able to say to his brothers in Genesis 50 and verses 20 and 21, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as to this day, to save many people alive. Now, therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. From the beginning to the end, he looks to serve God in the midst, of his suffering and his pain. I can remember it was just a couple of years. We still hadn't really, what I call, rounded the corner in our grief. And an invitation came from several missionaries to go to the country of Bosnia to minister in several of the churches there, and to also speak for a week in the Bible school. And so, I kind of weighed it, in my heart, and I said, no, I'm not emotionally ready to do that. And, plus, the Civil War had just ended there. There was a lot of tremendous instability still in the country. And I said, no, somebody else is going to have to do that. But the missionaries kept, they extended me 3 invitations after I said 2 no's. And finally, I held it before the Lord, and I felt like, the Lord saying, son, this is something I want you to do. I want you to go. And I said, okay. But inside I'm thinking, nah, I'm still not going to go. If I say okay, maybe he won't really see my hesitancy. I mean, the little games that we play, with God, even though theologically we know better. And I said, I'm just not going to even tell anybody. I mean, it's going to be an expensive trip. And I'm not going to tell anybody, that I'm even looking to go. And, unless you ask people for help, no help is going to be forthcoming. And so I'll get out of it that way. I'll be able to say, well, I can't go because I can't afford it. But anyway, within 3 weeks' time, I mean, it was just one of those amazing supernatural financial things that happened. People coming, and the whole trip was paid for, basically in 3 weeks. So I said, okay, God, I get the picture. I'm going. Not really happy, but I'm going. But it was such a profound experience. I ended up making 3 trips, to that country. But the first one was so special. The second trip, I was invited by the national leadership to speak at their yearly youth conference. And that was a great honor, because it didn't come from the missionaries; it came from the national workers. The second invitation, but the first one, I was all around the country. I was doing the stuff in the Bible school. I was ministering in a lot of the key cities. Sarajevo, I was in Sarajevo. Matter of fact, the day right after they had laid the foundation, for the church that's now standing there, I stood on the foundation and prayed with the leadership. And but after I ministered there, and the missionaries had said all along, we really sense an openness of the people, to you, because of what you've gone through. and the word was just kind of out, that we had had that kind of loss, in our lives. And it really hit me forcibly the day after I ministered. I actually ministered in the church, the makeshift church they had before the main one was built, and there was threats on the leadership there, and so the UN forces were there with machine guns sitting in the front row when I preached. And but after it was over, I had shared just a little bit about my testimony about losing the girls and the process that we were walking through. And we were driving around the city, and I was in the front seat, and with the pastor, and the assistant pastor was in the back, and another woman who spoke pretty good English. She was in the back, and they were showing me all the things that happened in the city. The city is basically still in rubble, and from all the shelling and stuff that had happened. And she said, that was where our apartment was. And the pastor actually stopped the car, right there in the middle of Sarajevo. And it was a bombed out building, and she said they would shell, our apartments for days, and then the shelling would stop. And she said at that point we would try to come out and get a little water and food on the black market. And she said that day that the shelling stopped, my husband, she said we had 3 daughters. And she said my husband and I had vacillated, who should go. And the girls were so terrified, she said I decided that it would be best for my husband to stay with them, because the snipers set up in the high-rise buildings and would try to shoot the people, as they're coming out to get their food and water. Literally, over 5,000 children alone, children 8 and under were killed by sniper fire, just trying to find food when the shelling would stop. So she said I was out, and I did get some food, I did get some water, I'm headed back, and the shelling started, and she said I knew that it had to hit close to our neighborhood. She said, but when I got here, she said our building had taken a direct hit. And she said, she pointed to that second floor, and she said, I walked into to our living room, and there was my husband, and my 3 daughters were dead. All 4 of them were dead on the floor. And when she said that, man, my circuits just blew. And I just began to cry in the car. I looked at her and I said, I can't understand that kind of unbelievable, senseless pain and loss. And she looked back at me without missing a beat, and she said, oh, but you can understand it, because it makes no sense that your daughter died eating a piece of fish. And it was just such a profound connection that we had at that moment. Now, am I saying that God took my daughter and my granddaughter so I could minister more effectively in Bosnia? No, absolutely not. But I'm saying as I embraced the process of healing, it was something that happened in me that made me more accessible into the hurts of other people, because the reality is in that country, everybody had lost somebody. In my world, people had said, wow, that was, a matter of fact, one guy said to me, the thing that happened to you, sat right in my office and said it, I wanted to smack him, but, God gave me grace. He said, the thing that I feared most for my family, happened to you. And he said, although I'm sorry it happened to you, but I'm figuring if it happened to you, there's a good chance now it's not going to happen to me. And, I didn't even know how to respond, to that comment, but anyway, the reality in this country was, people were saying, wow, this is unbelievable. This is something out of the unusual. It was nothing unusual in Bosnia. And you get into the city, you get into the church that we were in for almost 7 years in the inner city of Rochester, 300 African Americans, and Connie and I. We showed up on Sunday, and it was we stood out, but it was our church, and we were actually installed as elders in that church. Everybody had lost, drive-by shootings, and stuff that's happening. So many people have experienced these kind of devastating losses, and so we must give to others out of our pain, because it produces a profound connection and a deeper healing in us. The bottom of the page there, if we give out of our pain, we receive healing and we release blessing into the lives of others. Number 4, we must realize that suffering is intended to draw us into deeper dependency upon God. Notice Paul in 2 Corinthians 1, verses 7 to 9. Look at the last part, of the verse. But as a result, we stopped relying on ourselves and learned to rely only on God who raises the dead. The experience of suffering also deepens our relationship with Christ and expands our capacity to touch other hurting people. Anything that will cause me to rely more completely on God, I say in the end, I want to embrace that, even if it means catastrophic loss. And Paul says, the comfort that I have received is the comfort now that I can give to others. 2 Corinthians 1, verses 3 to 5. Number 5, we must open our hearts to receive new blessing. Some statements that are very important. Pain and loss are a process, not a destination. And what I mean by that is we cannot allow any loss, no matter how horrific, to become the defining moment of our lives. The defining moment of my life is not the loss that I experienced. Some people feel like, this is now becomes an altar. This becomes a shrine. Parents who lose a child and they never touch the child's room after that. 20 years later, it's exactly as the child had it. When they used to be in that room. It becomes a shrine. Grief becomes a final destination. It's a process to something deeper, something more significant. God not only restores, but as I said, He brings new blessing that could not have been experienced if the past normal was still in place. For example, what happened for our lives is we were so close to our son-in-law, and he was, I loved him and was in relationship with him even before he dated my daughter. He was here at Elam for 3 years, and just one of those young men that I loved like a son that had come from my own body. And now he was married, to my daughter. Well, we continued to have very, very deep relationship with him. No man could have honored my daughter more in the way that he grieved for her for 4 years. He just honored her. And he was a good-looking guy, and he was in a church with a lot of people his age, and there was a lot of girls that were coming after him right away, bringing him meals and, offering to iron his shirts because he taught school every day. And, there was just all kinds of people that were throwing himself, but he would not allow himself to go down even one step down that road until he had experienced healing. But he called us one day and he said, Dad, Mom, he said, I think I've met somebody. And we had prayed for that day. I said, this guy, is, I want somebody new to come into his life. I want him to have a new family. And he said, but I've told her, he said, her husband left her, he said, the same time that Renee died about 4 years ago. And she left her when she was actually pregnant with, at that point, was a little 4-year-old boy. And she also had a 7-year-old daughter. And he said, but I've told her the relationship can't go any further unless you and Mom bless it. And so I'm coming up, and I want you to meet her, and I want you to meet the children. And, well, no pressure there. I'm feeling, tremendous amount of pressure. But from the moment that woman got out of the car with her 2 little children, they walked into our hearts. And the relationship is so close with her today that she's actually requested to be referred to. And if you ask me how many daughters I have, I say I have 3. 2 that came from the body of my wife, but 1 came from the hand and the heart of God, and her name is Michelle. And those children, of course, they didn't end up getting married. Now they have 2 of their own. Those 4 grandchildren are as closely linked with our lives as you can possibly imagine. And as I held, Michelle last Christmas time, and we'll be together in just a couple weeks, all the family together. And I said to her, I just can't even imagine my life, without you now. And I said, as awful and as horrendous it was having lost Renee, and it's not like, you replaced her like putting another brick in the wall. But the reality, is that if I wouldn't have lost Renee, I wouldn't have had you. And we just kind of wept and cried together as we just pondered the spiritual reality of that. And I guess that's what Haggai is talking about. The future glory will be greater than the past glory, says the Lord of heaven's armies. Well, in conclusion, just let me quickly say this. The question of the ages: why would God create the world if he knew that pain and suffering would be released in the earth? There's a strong move, I've mentioned it before in this class, called open theism. It's a new theology, and basically open theism is saying God doesn't see the future. And so when he created Adam and Eve, he didn't see that the fall would actually take place. The open theists say if he could have seen that the fall was going to take place, he never, ever, would have created the world. Because he would never have allowed suffering to come in. But because he didn't see it, now he works with it. And he's moving in a redemptive plan. And open theism even goes as far as to say God doesn't know what decision you're going to make 10 years from now. He's a pretty good chess player, and he can think 3 or 4 or 5 or even sometimes 7 or 8 moves ahead. But he doesn't know for sure what you are going to choose. And I begin to struggle with that in connection with this question. If God, if I believe, is omniscient and always has been omniscient, if he could have seen that kind of suffering being released in the earth, why would he create? Because he loves people so much. And the answer very simply, but very profoundly, came to me when one of my friends said to me, actually in the process of writing the book, said, if you were able, to make a choice at this point, if you could have seen the loss of your daughter and the loss of your granddaughter, if you could have seen that before your wife got pregnant, would you have made a choice to have her? And my immediate response was, absolutely. In a nanosecond, I would have made the same choice. Because the years that I had with her were so incredibly precious. Or if you've ever seen the little video that is so heart-wrenching, 88 balloons or 90 balloons, the chronicle of this family that had a baby that was born and only lived for 90 days. And they released 90 balloons after the baby died, but talking about what happened day by day, how profoundly their lives were changed by that little baby that basically was, short of dramatic healing, was doomed to die within months after it was born. And they were asked that question, would you have the baby again? In a second we would walk through it again because of all that it meant. And when I gave that answer out of my own heart, I heard the heart of God. And the answer is, why would God create the world if he knew that pain and suffering would be released in the earth? The answer is God wanted you in his family. The price of everything that's happened as a result of the fall was worth it to have you in his family. That's what Paul's talking about in Ephesians 1. God decided in advance to adopt us into his own family, bringing us to himself through Jesus Christ. This is what he wanted to do, and it gave him great pleasure. And so at this Christmas season, to have that comfort that no price was too great for him to pay, because he wanted me and he wanted you in his family. God bless you. Have a good morning.